I want to start with Rosewood, and then I want to start with your um, conversion of the criminal processing system.
Mhm.
Okay, so on Rosewood, tell me a little bit about what was happening there, how you all got approached to chase down in the reparations, and what you accomplished.
Rosewood occurred, the destruction of the small, thriving African-American community in Rosewood in 1923. Had been covered on the AP wires across the United States and in the black press across the United States, but it had been buried in Florida's history. The way I was introduced to Rosewood was by a kind of nutty guy. His name was Michael O. McCarthy, and he was a hustle. And I know a hustle when I see one. But he had a story, and he claimed he had the last two survivors of Rosewood signed up to a movie contract. And he had taken that to, he felt he needed a courtroom scene to tell the story of the conflict. And so he'd been to the normal people that you would expect to go to on that. He'd been to the NAACP, and he'd been to the Southern Poverty Law Center and whoever else, and they'd all turned him down. They said, the case is 70 years old. I mean, give me a break, okay? And he'd heard about this guy in Tallahassee who was kind of the patron saint of lost causes, and that would be me. So he came to me, okay? And I knew that he was a hustle, but the story intrigued me. So he said he had the last two survivors, and one was Lee Ruth Bradley Davis down in Miami, and the other was Minnie Lee Langley in Jacksonville. I said, well, let's go see him. So I said, you stay here and I'll go see him. And so I went down, I saw the Ruth Bradley Davis, and powerful, strong woman, clear recollection of what had happened to her when she was 8 or 9 or 10 years old, and what happened thereafter and what effect it had on the family thereafter. Then I went up to Jacksonville to see Minnie Lee Langley. And I think Minnie Lee Langley was probably the most impressive client that I've ever met, and probably the most harmed. She, her aunt Sarah Carrier, was kind of the matriarch of Rosewood. Lived in a 2-story house, upholstered furniture, piano. Mother of Sylvester Carrier, who is the mega figure in Rosewood, who'd been over in World War I and was an expert marksman. Had visited Paris and the Paris bars and clubs before he came back, and was considered a very threatening man to white people in and around Rosewood, particularly the white people in Sumner, where a lot of Rosewood people, not all of them, but a lot of them worked in the mill. So I interviewed Minnie Lee. She had these tiny little arms, feisty, and really remembered it vividly. Her Aunt Sarah wanted her to be a nurse. And that's what Minnie's life was going to be until this happened. And after they burned the town down, and Minnie fled through the night in her little nighties in a cold January night, along with all those other kids and women and men. Minnie worked in a brush factory for over 30 years. She lived in a very broken down section of Jacksonville, Florida, all black, of course. The brush factory was eventually moved to Mexico, and she had no pension and lived on Social Security and a very limited income. But my God, did she remember the story? Well, back up a little bit. Rosewood started when a white woman who was having an affair with a with a having an affair with a white man, got beat up by the white man, and so she couldn't let her husband know that, and she that it was a black man, and all hell broke loose, and one man was hanged, and we eventually produced a white witness who witnessed that hanging, would come forward and testify.
Oh my God.
And they thought, maybe that was the wrong black person. So they thought it was Sylvester Carrier. And they came to the Carrier house. And the mob was there. And the mob was, this went on for 6 days. The governor was fully on notice of it, went hunting, did nothing. The Klan was surrounding, and, hell was going to be paid. And as the constable came through the front door of Sarah Carrier's house, the kids were all upstairs except Minnie Lee. She was down right in front of that front door. Apparently she hadn't gone up there, and her cousin Sylvester grabbed her with his left hand and pulled her in like this, and he's kind of sitting there under the stairwell as the constable comes through the front door, and he's got a shotgun, and he blows the constable away, and the deputy constable comes in and he blows that guy away, and then all hell broke loose, and they burned that town down. And some of them got out, and they got to the train station and got out, spread out all over, but a lot of them to the Coochie, Florida, where the Sumner Mill burned down 3 years later and was relocated to the Coochie, Florida. It had never been told, but I knew when I saw Minnie Lee Langway, she was going to be my lead witness, and we were going to do this case. Okay, I don't care if I was 70 years old or not. And Florida I had some familiarity with some work I'd done earlier in my career with Florida's claims bill. It's a claims bill process that's there for when the state generally asserts sovereign immunity. I don't believe in sovereign immunity, but sovereign immunity is a well-established document and a doctrine, and it means that if the state gets sued, they're for like a DOT truck driver or whatever, somebody kills somebody negligently, and the jury comes back with a $1 million verdict against the state will pay only up to $250, and then it's a matter of $250,000. And then it's a matter of legislative grace after that, if you can prove that the state had a moral responsibility. I thought that was a pretty good test. The state had a moral responsibility to prosecute the people that did that and bring them to justice and restore the Rosewood people to their homes. And they had not done that in 1923. Or 33, or 43, or 53, 63, 73, 83, 93. So the statute of limitations never ran. That's capital murder.
Oh, wow.
So, and at the hearing, you have a hearing before a hearing officer in the legislature. So, we want a number of things, but number one, this is really the first African-American reparations case.
Right.
Japanese reparations case, and of course we use that as precedent. And there'd been, I think it was really the only thing we had other than our case, but it was certainly the first for African Americans. We said we need a number of things. Number one, you got to pay money. And frankly, it's more important that you pay it than it is that they receive it, because a lump sum cash, particularly to these older people in their 70s and 80s, et cetera, they're going to give it away. They're going to give it to their church, to their sons and daughters, whatever. They care about the money, okay?
Yeah. Right.
What they really wanted, they wanted their story told.
Yes, definitely.
Okay? And they lived their lives in fear. Minnie Lee had lived her life in that little tiny home in Jacksonville, Florida, in fear because they were witnesses to unprosecuted crimes. And they thought at any moment, if they ever said anything, they'd be killed. We put on a great African-American female psychologist to describe. She'd interviewed them, and described the trauma that not only the survivors, but also the descendants because they would hear every once in a while, but you're not to tell anybody, don't tell anybody. Because people would come and do bad things to us, etc. Finally, the matriarch of the family died, and she said, after my death, you can come forward. And Arnett Doctor, who was, was a remarkable human being, was the leader of the Rosewood family during this period of time. I'll never forget the day of the hearing. Put Minnie Lee on. You could hear a pin drop as she told that testimony. There were about 200 or 300 people in the courtroom. There was a legislative hearing room up in Tallahassee, and we had international and national press. And it was stunning. And we put on 3 more. And they were Willie Evans and Arnett Goines and I'm forgetting. I'll remember it before it's over. But they were just compelling witnesses. And the state hearing examiner was a brilliant guy, and he came back with a report and said, I think 150 grand a piece for those survivors. He based that on some other case. And then there would be another $500,000 for those descendants who could prove that their people were there with property, that they descended from people who actually were there and had property at the time. And most importantly, in the legislature, required in the curriculum for education, okay? And I forgot one important part of the story. And that is that it took 2 years to do this. And in the first year, we got a study commission. And it was led by a great woman, Maxine Jones, who's a great professor African-American professor at Florida State, at Florida State. And FAMU and the University of Florida. And they produced a report that said, hey, yeah, this really did happen. And it happened in the way that they said it happened. That report was critical in the legislature. So in any event, money, education, scholarships, okay, for anybody who could prove that they were a Rosewood descendant. There was a recent Washington Post story that showed how many of those there have been. And so I call Rosewood Reparations 101, okay? So what are the lessons we learned from Rosewood, okay? Number one is, since America, like Rosewood and Florida, has done everything it can to bury its ugly racial past. So there's a massive education program that has to happen first, okay? And there has to be a massive study involving the economics of slavery and involving the history of slavery. And the country has to come to terms with the fact that this country was started with a 4th century genocide with the native people who were here, which went well into the 19th century. And then it began with chattel slavery in 1619, and continued that for 2 centuries. And then it moved into convict leasing and Jim Crow, and then apartheid until about 1964, 65, and now the new Jim Crow that Michelle Alexander has so well documented, and so have so many others. So the vast majority of Americans right now are totally unfamiliar with this history. And of course, the vast majority, almost virtually every Floridian, was unfamiliar with the Rosewood history.
Absolutely, yeah.
So there's a massive education program that has to take place. And I think if the political winds keep going in the way that they're going right now, but I belong to a party that knows how to lose almost any election. But in case we find out how to win an election again, I think the first 100 days we'll see a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And I think Brian Stevenson would be the right person to head that up. And I think that there will be far more creative ways to deal with reparations than simply what we did in Rosewood.
Do you know about the House and Senate bills that have been put forward to establish a study and remedy, a commission on the study and remedy of reparations?
I do. It's going to take time. We need hearings. We need a study. The American people have to be educated on this. So you have centuries of ignorance, okay? And this would include policymakers, okay? And it would certainly include the United States Supreme Court. That's why that court destroyed the Voting Rights Act. They didn't think that race really played that kind of role in America. America is the only Western nation, civilized nation, that does not have a national equalization policy, okay, for education. Okay, so I live here in St. Louis City, Missouri, okay? In Clayton, Missouri, which is a couple miles away, they spend about 30 or 35 grand a year per child. Now, about 4 miles away from Clayton, maybe it's 5, 6, is Kinloch. They spend about $4,000 a year per pupil, okay? No other, and then we say to these kids, all right, you ready? You got your high school diploma? 1, 2, 3, go. You're all on the same starting line. You know, this is crazy, okay? Yeah. No other nation would do that, okay? So obviously we have to have a national equalization tax in order to get equal education. But the Supreme Court believes, Sandra Day O'Connor said, maybe give affirmative action 25 years. They believed in 25 years, everything, the problem would be solved. So I don't know what we're going to do there, but those are the kinds of things I think we need to do, those kinds of remedies in education, in criminal justice.
Yeah.
Okay.